There is a particular kind of suffering that arrives not from ignorance, but from too much awareness. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive as a crisis or a breakdown. It moves quietly, settling into the ordinary moments of a day, turning simple decisions into long internal negotiations, filling the silence before sleep with replayed conversations and imagined futures. Most people who experience it would not call it suffering at all. They would call it thinking. And they would assume, as they have always assumed, that more thinking is simply what careful people do. The strange irony at the center of this experience is that it tends to visit the most capable minds most persistently. The people who overthink are rarely the careless or the incurious. They are, more often, the ones who care most deeply about getting things right, about understanding fully, about not causing harm through a decision made too hastily. Their overthinking is, at its roots, a form of conscientiousness. It is intelligence turned inward without a clear destination, and it can be as exhausting as any physical labor, though it leaves no visible trace. What this video is not is a prescription. It will not offer 5 steps to a quieter mind or a technique for silencing inner noise. What it is, instead, is an inquiry, a slow philosophical walk through the question of why the thinking mind sometimes becomes its own obstacle, what that reveals about the nature of intelligence itself, and why the people who suffer most from this pattern are often the last ones to recognize it for what it is. The aim is not to fix anything. The aim is to see something clearly, perhaps for the first time. To do that, we have to begin not with the problem itself, but with what makes it possible. We have to begin with the remarkable, underappreciated fact that the human capacity for abstract thought, for imagining futures that do not yet exist, and examining pasts that cannot be changed, is one of the most extraordinary things that has ever evolved on this planet. And like most extraordinary things, it comes with a cost that is rarely discussed alongside the gift. Every trap is built from something useful. The same quality that makes a material strong can make it brittle under the right conditions. The same instinct that protects can, in the wrong context, imprison. The thinking mind is no different. Reflection, analysis, anticipation, these are not flaws. They are among the highest expressions of human cognitive capacity. But there exists a threshold, difficult to locate precisely and different for every person, beyond which thought stops serving the thinker and begins consuming them. Crossing that threshold is rarely a dramatic event. It happens gradually, like water finding the cracks in stone. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote in the 19th century about what he called the dizziness of freedom, the paralysis that sets in not from having no choices, but from having too many. He described the anxiety of standing at a crossroads where every path is open, where nothing compels you in any direction, where the freedom to choose anything becomes, paradoxically, the inability to choose at all. This was not, for Kierkegaard, a problem of weakness or indecision. It was a problem of consciousness, the inevitable burden of a mind capable of grasping its own situation fully enough to be overwhelmed by it. What Kierkegaard intuited philosophically, modern psychology has since documented with remarkable precision. The experience of choice overload, studied extensively by researchers like Barry Schwartz, shows that beyond a certain number of options, additional choices do not increase satisfaction. They reliably decrease it. More options produce more second-guessing, more regret, more anxiety about the road not taken. The thinking mind, faced with abundance, does not relax. It escalates. It searches for a level of certainty commensurate with the importance it assigns to the decision. And that level, in a world of genuine uncertainty, is almost never reachable. This is where the trap closes, not through malice or design, but through the simple mechanical logic of a system doing exactly what it was built to do in conditions for which it was not built. The human mind evolved to solve problems in environments where most problems had discoverable answers, where thinking longer often did yield better outcomes. In those environments, persistence of thought was rewarded. But modern life presents a different kind of problem. Situations where more thinking does not produce more clarity, where the variables multiply faster than conclusions can form, and where the cost of indecision is itself a kind of decision. The mind keeps running the algorithm that worked in one world, inside a world where the algorithm has no natural stopping point. Here is something that rarely appears in popular discussions of overthinking. The behavior is not random. It is not distributed evenly across human beings regardless of their cognitive profile. The research consistently points in a specific direction, toward the minds that carry more of what psychologists call need for cognition, the intrinsic drive to seek out, engage with, and deeply process complex information. These are the minds that find intellectual problems genuinely enjoyable, that are drawn instinctively toward nuance, that feel something close to discomfort when a complicated question receives a simple answer. These are, in the most direct sense, the minds that intelligence built. The connection runs deep. Intelligence, real cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously and move between them fluidly, is precisely the capacity that generates the raw material of overthinking. When a less analytically oriented mind encounters a decision, it tends to generate a manageable number of options and evaluate them sequentially. When a highly analytical mind encounters the same decision, it generates more options, attaches more conditional branches to each one, identifies more potential failure modes, and remains sensitive to more possible consequences. This is not a malfunction. This is the machinery of careful thought operating at full capacity. The price of that capacity is that it is very difficult to turn off. The philosopher William James, writing at the turn of the 20th century, described the stream of consciousness as something that never truly stops moving, that thoughts flow continuously into one another, one leading to the next through associations and implications that the thinker often cannot fully trace or control. For most minds, this stream moves along without catching too dramatically on any single feature of the landscape. For the highly intelligent mind, the stream catches frequently, on interesting problems, on unresolved tensions, on questions that reveal deeper questions beneath them. The richness of the intellectual environment becomes, in quiet moments, a source of inescapable stimulation. What this means, practically, is that the intelligent person searching for more possibilities is not being irrational. They are doing the most natural thing their mind knows how to do. Every additional possibility they consider is, from their perspective, a genuine attempt to arrive at a better answer. The tragedy is not that they are wrong to search. The tragedy is that for certain categories of problem, particularly those involving human relationships, personal values, and futures that cannot be calculated, more searching does not reliably produce better answers. The tools that serve the mind so well in one domain become misapplied in another, and the mind, following its own deep logic, cannot easily recognize the difference from the inside. Beneath most acts of overthinking, if you look carefully enough, there is a fear. Not always a large or obvious fear. Sometimes it is a barely perceptible anxiety, a low background hum of concern about consequences, about judgment, about loss. But it is there, and it performs a very specific function. It keeps the thinking moving. As long as the fear remains active, the mind generates reasons not to stop, one more angle to consider, one more risk to assess, one more scenario to imagine. The thinking does not stop because the fear has not been resolved. And the fear cannot be resolved through thinking, because the thing that frightens is the inherent uncertainty of the future, and no amount of analysis makes the future certain. Daniel Kahneman, whose decades of research into human judgment earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics, documented what he called loss aversion, the finding that the psychological pain of a loss is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Losing $10 feels approximately twice as bad as finding $10 feels good. This asymmetry runs deep in human psychology, and it reshapes the experience of decision-making in important ways. When the overthinker considers a choice, the potential losses of time, of relationships, of opportunities foregone, of reputation, of self-respect, weigh more heavily than the potential gains, even when the gains are objectively larger. The mind, calibrated by evolution to avoid loss above all else, keeps the assessment running in the direction of caution. There is a particular cruelty in how this plays out for conscientious people. The very qualities that make them careful, their awareness of consequences, their sensitivity to how their choices affect others, their genuine desire to get things right, amplify the weight of potential mistakes. A person who does not care much about outcomes does not fear wrong choices very much, because the concept of wrong carries no great charge for them. But for the person who cares deeply, who holds themselves to a high standard of thoughtfulness and responsibility, the wrong choice is not merely an inconvenience. It is a reflection on who they are. And that is a very difficult thing to risk, no matter how carefully you have thought it through. What makes this especially philosophically interesting is that the fear of wrong choices contains a hidden assumption that there exists, for any given situation, a correct answer that careful enough thought could in principle locate. This assumption is so deeply embedded that most overthinkers have never examined it directly, and yet it does not hold up well under scrutiny. Many of the decisions that attract the most agonizing analysis, whom to love, which path to follow, how to balance competing obligations, are not problems with hidden correct answers. They are problems with incommensurable values, where different choices express different versions of who you are, and where the question of which version is right is not one that logic can settle. The search for the correct answer continues not because it exists, but because the mind has not yet accepted that it might not. One of the most disorienting discoveries available to any serious thinker is the moment they realize that accumulating knowledge does not steadily increase confidence. For a while, it does. The early stages of learning about any subject produce a reliable sense of growing competence, of ground becoming more solid underfoot. But past a certain point, something shifts. The deeper you go into any domain of genuine complexity, the more you encounter the disputed questions, the unresolved controversies, the findings that contradict earlier findings, the experts who disagree with other experts. Knowledge, pursued honestly and far enough, eventually delivers you to the frontier, and the frontier, in almost every field worth studying, is characterized by uncertainty rather than resolution. Socrates understood this more than 2,000 years ago. His famous claim to know nothing, the foundation of his philosophical method, was not false modesty or rhetorical positioning. It was the report of someone who had thought carefully enough about enough things to see how much remained genuinely unknown. The Socratic method, with its relentless questioning of apparently settled answers, is not designed to produce conclusions. It is designed to reveal the hidden complexity beneath conclusions that seemed obvious before they were examined. For Socrates, this was the beginning of wisdom. But for many of the people it touches, it feels initially like the dissolution of wisdom, like the ground going soft precisely when you were counting on it to hold. Bertrand Russell captured something similar in his observation that the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always certain, while wiser people are full of doubt. This is not mere cynicism. It reflects something real about the relationship between depth of knowledge and degree of certainty. The person who has read one book on a subject is often more confident than the person who has read 50, because the first book gave them a framework while the next 49 complicated it. The expert who has spent a lifetime with a question is often more humble about it than the student who encountered it last semester. Knowledge, at depth, tends to reveal its own limits, and those limits are wider than most people, looking from the outside, would ever guess. For the overthinking mind, this dynamic is particularly consequential, because the overthinker does not stop at surface knowledge. They go deeper, reading more, researching further, seeking more authoritative sources, in search of the certainty that will finally allow them to act. But the deeper they go, the more complexity they find, and the more complexity they find, the less certain they feel, and the less certain they feel, the more they search. The loop is elegant in its frustration. The very process they are using to resolve their doubt is the process most reliably guaranteed to produce more of it. Wisdom, pursued honestly, does not always deliver the confidence that motivated the pursuit. There is a moment in the life of any protracted deliberation when the analysis stops serving the decision and begins substituting for it. It is not always easy to recognize this moment from the inside, because the thinking continues to feel purposeful. Each new consideration seems relevant, each additional angle seems worth examining. But something has quietly shifted. The deliberation is no longer moving toward a conclusion. It has become, in a subtle but real sense, a way of not arriving at one. Analysis, in this mode, functions not as a tool for making better decisions, but as a place to live while avoiding the discomfort of making them at all. The ancient Stoic philosophers were deeply interested in the relationship between thought and action, and several of them identified what we might now recognize as a version of this dynamic. Marcus Aurelius, writing his private meditations as Emperor of Rome, a man whose decisions affected millions of lives and who could not afford the luxury of indefinite deliberation, returned repeatedly to the theme of doing what the moment requires, of not allowing reflection to become a substitute for engagement with the world. His philosophy was not anti-intellectual. It was a recognition that thought divorced from action eventually becomes a kind of paralysis wearing the costume of wisdom. Self-actualized individuals, people he identified as living with unusual authenticity and effectiveness. What distinguished them, in part, was not superior analytical ability or more comprehensive information. It was a willingness to act on incomplete information, to make decisions while acknowledging uncertainty, and to trust that course correction was possible after the fact. They understood something that the overthinking mind resists, that in most situations, a good decision made promptly and adjusted as needed outperforms a perfect decision arrived at too late. The world moves while you deliberate, and the ground on which your analysis stands shifts beneath you as time passes. What makes the shift from analysis to avoidance so difficult to detect is that it feels virtuous from the inside. The person who cannot stop thinking about a decision is not lazy. They are not indifferent. They are, by their own lights, being responsible, ensuring that they have thought about it thoroughly enough, that they have not overlooked anything important, that they will not have to live with regret. This felt sense of conscientiousness masks what is actually happening, that the cost of the analysis, in time, in energy, in the opportunities that pass during the deliberation, has long since exceeded the cost of the imperfect decision they are avoiding. The thinking has not been serving the decision for some time. It has been serving the avoidance of the decision. And the mind, which generated the thinking, is the last to know. In 1956, the economist and cognitive scientist Herbert Simon introduced a concept that quietly overturned one of the most deeply held assumptions in classical economics, the assumption that rational actors seek to maximize their outcomes. Simon's research led him to a different conclusion, that human beings do not, in practice, optimize. They satisfy. They search for an option that is good enough, that meets a threshold of acceptability, and they stop when they find it. This was not a description of irrational behavior. It was a description of the only rational behavior available to a mind operating under realistic constraints of time, information, and cognitive capacity. Perfect optimization, Simon argued, is not merely difficult. In most real-world situations, it is logically impossible. The illusion of the perfect decision is one of the most persistent and costly fictions the overthinking mind maintains. It holds, usually below the level of conscious articulation, that somewhere in the space of available options there exists a choice that is unambiguously correct, that minimizes regret, maximizes benefit, satisfies all relevant values simultaneously, and would be endorsed by any sufficiently wise observer. The search for this choice is what keeps the analysis running long after a reasonable threshold has been crossed. But the choice does not exist, not because the thinker is not smart enough to find it, but because the category itself is largely an invention. Most significant decisions involve genuine trade-offs between things that cannot be reduced to a common currency, and no amount of reasoning can make incommensurable values commensurable. The philosopher Ruth Chang has spent much of her career examining what she calls hard cases, decisions where the alternatives are, in a precise philosophical sense, incomparable, not equal, and not ranked, but genuinely beyond comparison on a single scale. Choosing between a career that offers security and one that offers meaning is not a problem with a hidden correct answer that better analysis would reveal. It is a problem where two different choices express two different, but equally coherent visions of a life, and where the question of which vision is right cannot be settled by reference to any external standard. Chang's insight is that hard cases are not hard because we lack information. They are hard because the structure of the problem itself resists the kind of resolution we are searching for. For the overthinking mind, accepting this is genuinely difficult, perhaps the most difficult intellectual concession it is asked to make. Because if the perfect decision does not exist, then the search for it is not just frustrating but structurally misconceived. The standard against which every option has been found wanting is a standard that nothing could meet, because it was constructed by a mind seeking an escape from the irreducible uncertainty of choice. Recognizing this does not make decisions easier immediately, but it does change what you are doing when you make them. You are no longer failing to find the right answer. You are doing the most human thing there is, choosing, under uncertainty, without guarantees, in full acknowledgement that you are shaping rather than discovering your path forward. The neuroscience of uncertainty has revealed something that feels both obvious and startling once stated clearly. The human brain treats uncertainty as a threat, not metaphorically, not loosely, but in the same neural circuits and with many of the same biochemical signatures as physical danger. Neuroscientist Tali Sharot and her colleagues have documented how the brain's threat detection systems activate in response to ambiguous or unresolved situations, generating a state of vigilance and discomfort that motivates the organism to resolve the uncertainty as quickly as possible. The discomfort of not knowing is not a psychological weakness. It is a biological signal, ancient and insistent, that something requires attention. This helps explain why overthinking feels so compulsive, why it is so difficult to simply decide to stop. Each cycle of analysis is, at a neurological level, an attempt to satisfy the brain's demand for resolution. The thinking feels urgent because the system that generates it is designed to treat uncertainty as something that needs to be fixed before safety can be restored. But in situations where genuine certainty is not available, where the future is unknowable and the variables are too complex to fully map, the brain keeps generating the signal without ever receiving the satisfaction of resolution. It is like a fire alarm responding to fog. The alarm is working exactly as designed, but the thing it is detecting is not something that can be extinguished. The psychologist and researcher Michel Dugas has studied what he calls intolerance of uncertainty, the degree to which individuals find ambiguous situations distressing and unacceptable. His research shows that this trait is one of the strongest predictors of worry and overthinking, more reliable than measures of actual risk or negative outcome probability. People with high intolerance of uncertainty worry not because their situations are objectively more dangerous, but because their nervous systems respond more intensely to the mere fact of not knowing. And critically, his research shows that the strategies most commonly used to manage this distress, information seeking, repeated reassurance, exhaustive analysis, provide only temporary relief before the discomfort returns, often stronger than before. What the brain is seeking, underneath all the thinking, is not a better answer. It is safety. It wants the future to be known, the risks to be cataloged, the outcomes to be secured. This is a want that the thinking mind can never fully satisfy, because the future is genuinely open, the risks genuinely real, and the outcomes genuinely uncertain. Every civilization that has ever existed has developed rituals, philosophies, and religious practices partly in response to this basic neurological reality, the unbearable openness of what comes next. The overthinking mind is engaged in its own private version of this ancient project, trying, through the force of concentrated thought, to make solid what is by nature fluid. It is an entirely human endeavor, and it is, in the end, one that thought alone cannot complete. There is a quiet asymmetry at the heart of intelligent perception. The same cognitive capacity that allows a person to anticipate good outcomes also, and more powerfully, allows them to anticipate bad ones. This is not a design flaw. It is an evolutionary feature. A mind that can model the future in detail can prepare for threats that have not yet materialized. This capacity has been enormously valuable across human history, allowing for the kind of long-range planning that made complex civilization possible. But it also means that the more vividly and accurately a mind can imagine the future, the more vividly and accurately it can imagine everything that could go wrong in it. The psychologist Elaine Aron's research into what she calls the highly sensitive person documents a profile that overlaps significantly with the overthinker. Individuals who process sensory and emotional information more deeply than average, who notice subtleties that others miss, who are moved more strongly by both beauty and suffering, and who tend to become overwhelmed in environments of high stimulation. One of the consistent features of this profile is a heightened awareness of risk, not because these individuals are more fearful by temperament, but because they are genuinely perceiving more. The risks they worry about are not imaginary. They are real risks that a less attentive mind would simply not have registered. This creates a particular kind of cognitive burden that is rarely acknowledged in discussions of overthinking. When someone says you're catastrophizing to a person who overthinks, they are often partially right. The probability assigned to negative outcomes may be inflated. But they are also often partially wrong, because the range of negative outcomes being considered is frequently accurate. The overthinker is not inventing risks from nothing. They are noticing genuine possibilities that exist in the situation, and they are taking those possibilities seriously in a way that feels not like anxiety, but like responsibility. The difficulty is not that they are wrong to notice. The difficulty is that noticing everything and weighting everything equally makes the landscape of any decision feel impossibly dense. This is perhaps the chapter most likely to produce the recognition that this video is aiming for, the sense of being finally seen. Because the smart person who overthinks has spent much of their life being told, implicitly or explicitly, that their awareness of risk is disproportionate, that they should relax, that they are making things more complicated than they need to be. And some of that feedback is, in specific cases, fair. But underneath it is a failure to recognize something true about how their mind works, that they are not manufacturing complexity where none exists. They are perceiving complexity that is genuinely there, and carrying the weight of that perception largely alone, without adequate acknowledgement that the perception itself is a form of intelligence, even when it is also, in its persistence, a form of suffering. Long after the immediate decision has been made, the analysis often continues. The overthinker replays the conversation that happened yesterday, examining whether they said the right thing, whether they were misunderstood, whether a different response would have landed better. They rehearse the conversation that will happen tomorrow, preparing for contingencies, anticipating objections, constructing responses to questions that may never be asked. They review choices already made and long since acted upon, asking whether a different path would have led somewhere better. The mind moves in all directions through time simultaneously, rarely settling for long in the present, which is the only place where rest is actually available. The Buddhist philosophical tradition has perhaps the most sustained and precise analysis of this phenomenon in the history of human thought. The concept of the monkey mind, citta in Pali, the restless, leaping, chattering quality of undisciplined thought, describes exactly this quality of consciousness that the overthinker inhabits. The tradition does not pathologize this state. It simply observes it clearly, without judgment, as the default condition of the untrained mind in engagement with the world. What it offers is not the elimination of thought, but a different relationship to it, the ability to watch thoughts arise and pass without being entirely swept along by each one. The stillness this practice cultivates is not the absence of thinking. It is a spaciousness around thinking, a quality of observation that the thought stream moves through rather than fills entirely. The philosopher Pascal, in the 17th century, wrote one of the most penetrating observations about this condition, that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. What Pascal identified was not laziness or stupidity as the root of human restlessness, quite the opposite. He saw the restlessness as an escape from something, from the silence in which the mind encounters itself without distraction, without the projects and preoccupations that normally structure experience. For the overthinker, who often experiences silence not as rest, but as an invitation for the internal machinery to run at full speed, Pascal's observation resonates with particular force. The mind that cannot rest is not broken. It is a mind that has not yet found, or been taught, how to be present with itself without an agenda. What is perhaps most important to understand about this quality is that it is not simply a burden. The same mind that cannot switch off at night, that runs through scenarios while others sleep, that returns persistently to unresolved questions. This mind is also, and by the same mechanism, the mind that makes unexpected connections, that solves problems in the shower, that wakes with an insight that daylight thinking could not produce. The inability to rest and the capacity for depth are features of the same architecture. You do not get one without the other. This does not make the exhaustion less real, but it does suggest that the goal is not to silence the mind, which is, in any case, beyond most people's reach, but to understand it well enough to work with it rather than against it. Daniel Kahneman's framework of two systems of thought has become one of the most influential ideas in contemporary psychology. System 1, fast, automatic, associative, operating largely below conscious awareness, produces the snap judgments, the gut feelings, the immediate impressions that arrive before deliberate thinking has had time to engage. System 2, slow, deliberate, effortful, the system that does long division and constructs logical arguments, is what most people mean when they talk about thinking. The relationship between these two systems is more complicated and more interesting than the popular summary suggests, particularly for the question of when each serves better than the other. The psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer has spent much of his career pushing back against the assumption that slower, more deliberate analysis is always superior to intuitive judgment. His research on what he calls ecological rationality shows that in certain domains, particularly those involving complex pattern recognition, social judgment, and situations where the relevant variables are too numerous to consciously track, simple heuristics and gut instincts reliably outperform elaborate analytical frameworks. The chess grandmaster who sees the right move before analyzing it consciously is not being irrational. They are accessing a form of compressed expertise, thousands of hours of experience encoded in pattern recognition. That deliberate analysis would take far longer to replicate, if it could reach the same conclusion at all. For the overthinker, this is genuinely difficult to accept, because the entire identity of careful, thorough, responsible deliberation is built around the value of explicit reasoning. To suggest that the first feeling might sometimes be more trustworthy than the 100th analysis is, for this kind of mind, almost heretical. And it is not always true. Intuition carries its own biases and blind spots that careful reasoning can and should correct. But the blanket dismissal of intuition in favor of analysis misses something important. That much of what we know in forms that cannot be fully articulated. The body holds knowledge. Experience encodes wisdom in ways that are real and reliable, but not fully accessible to conscious inspection. Ignoring this is not more rational. It is a different kind of error. What philosophy and neuroscience together suggest is that the highest form of human judgment is not pure analysis or pure intuition, but a fluid movement between them. The ability to think carefully when careful thinking yields better answers, and to trust the deeper pattern when the analysis has reached its natural limits. The Zen concept of Mushin, literally no mind, the state of effortless responsiveness that masters in martial arts, music, and other skilled domains describe, is not the absence of knowledge. It is knowledge so thoroughly integrated that it no longer requires deliberate retrieval. The overthinker is not incapable of this. They have simply, in many areas of life, learned to distrust the quick answer so thoroughly that they cannot hear it anymore over the noise of the analysis. There is a kind of wisdom that does not look like wisdom from the inside. It does not feel like certainty or clarity or the satisfying click of a well-reasoned conclusion. It feels, instead, like settling, like accepting something less than what you were reaching for, making peace with a situation that has not been fully resolved. The culture of analytical achievement tends to regard this feeling as failure, a sign that the thinking was not thorough enough, that the right answer was not yet found, that more work remains. But there is another way to understand it, as the recognition that some of the most important truths in human experience are truths that cannot be completed, only approached. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein ended his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with a sentence that has echoed through philosophy ever since. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The line is usually read as a boundary, a demarcation of what language and logic can and cannot reach. But it can also be read as a kind of permission, that not everything requires articulation, that some things are known in ways that speaking would diminish, that the incomplete answer is sometimes more honest than the complete one. For the overthinker who has spent years trying to think their way to the bottom of every question, This is a genuinely strange and liberating idea, that stopping before the answer is finished might, in some cases, be the wisest move available. The poet John Keats, writing to his brothers in 1817, described what he called negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. He identified this capacity as characteristic of the greatest creative and intellectual minds, and its opposite, the refusal to tolerate irresolution, the insistence on forcing every question to a conclusion, as the enemy of genuine depth. Keats was writing about poetry and art, but the observation applies far more broadly. The minds that have contributed most to human understanding are very often the ones that could hold a question open for years, decades, lifetimes, turning it over, living with it, allowing it to reveal its dimensions slowly rather than forcing it to yield a premature answer. What the wisdom of the incomplete answer offers is not less thinking, but differently oriented thinking. Thought that aims at understanding rather than resolution, that values clarity of perception over conclusiveness of judgment, that recognizes some questions as companions for life rather than problems to be solved and set aside. For the overthinker, this reorientation is not a defeat. It is a maturation. It is the movement from a mind that uses thinking to pursue certainty into a mind that uses thinking to pursue depth, and discovers, somewhere along the way, that depth and certainty are not the same thing, that one is always available and the other almost never is, and that a life lived fully in the presence of genuine questions is richer, not poorer, than one spent trying to eliminate them. There is something that happens in the mind when the thinking finally quiets, not through effort, not through discipline, but through a kind of natural exhaustion that is different from the depletion of overthinking. It arrives sometimes in the early morning, before full waking consciousness has assembled itself. Sometimes in the middle of physical activity, when the body is engaged and the analytical mind has been given something simple to occupy it. Sometimes at the end of a long conversation, after the talking has finished and the silence settles. In these moments, without the noise of deliberation filling the available space, something becomes visible that the thinking had been covering. Not always an answer, sometimes not an answer at all, but a quality of seeing that is cleaner, less contested, more settled than what analysis typically produces. The neuroscientist Marcus Raichel's discovery of what he called the default mode network illuminated something remarkable, that the brain does not go quiet when deliberate thinking stops. The Taoist tradition has a concept called Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, that describes the alignment of the individual with the natural movement of things, the state in which the right response arises spontaneously rather than through forcing. This is not passivity. It is a deep form of attentiveness, the capacity to perceive what a situation actually calls for, unclouded by what the anxious mind insists it must produce. The master craftsman in Zhuangzi's parables does not think about where to cut. They have thought long enough, deeply enough, that the thinking has passed through them and left something cleaner in its place. This is not an experience reserved for Taoist masters. It is available to any mind that learns, occasionally and imperfectly, to let the current carry it rather than swimming against it. And this, perhaps, is where the inquiry comes to rest, not with a solution, not with a technique, but with an observation. The mind that overthinks is not a broken mind. It is a mind that has not yet made peace with the fact that it cannot think its way to the safety it is seeking, because the safety it is seeking does not exist in the form it imagines. What does exist, what has always existed, waiting patiently on the other side of the noise, is something quieter and more durable, the simple presence of a mind that has, for a moment, stopped trying to be anywhere other than where it is. Clarity does not arrive as a reward for thinking hard enough. It arrives, when it arrives, as what remains when the thinking finally grows still. You have probably felt it. That still, knowing quality beneath all the motion. It was never far away. It was always there, just underneath, waiting, as it always waits, for the surface to calm.